Bud Callahan snatched the plate right out of Evelyn's hands. Not accidentally, not in a hurry. He looked her dead in the eyes when he did it, turned the plate sideways, and let every biscuit she'd baked since 4 that morning tumble onto the dirt floor of the bunkhouse. "Cook's job," he said, loud enough for every man in the room to hear, "is to cook, not to stand there flapping her mouth about weather she don't understand." He stepped on one of the biscuits. Deliberate, slow. "Clean that up." Nobody moved to stop him. A couple of the younger hands looked away. One almost laughed. Evelyn looked at the biscuits on the floor. Then she looked at the sky through the open bunkhouse door. That specific shade of bruised yellow-gray she had seen once before, 15 years ago. The winter 3 men froze to death on a ranch 2 counties east of here because nobody wanted to listen to a woman who cooked their meals. She picked up the biscuits without a word, and she started preparing for what was coming. If you've never seen a story like this one, about the woman everyone ignored until she was the only thing standing between them and a grave, then stay right here, because this one goes places most people aren't brave enough to tell. Subscribe to the channel right now, hit that like button, and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to know how far this story travels. Don't go anywhere. You'll want to see how this ends. Evelyn Hartley had been at Iron Ridge Ranch for 14 months, and in that time she had learned one thing with absolute certainty. The men here listened to whoever spoke loudest, and she had never in her life been a loud woman. That was not the same as being a quiet one. There was a difference. A difference she understood the way you understand something that's been pressed into you over years until it becomes part of how you breathe. Quiet meant you had nothing to say. Evelyn always had something to say. She had simply learned across 3 ranches and 1 dead husband and more winters than she cared to count that saying it often cost more than it was worth. Until it didn't. Until the cost of silence was higher than the cost of speaking. She was 43 years old, and she had the hands to prove it. Cracked at the knuckles, scarred along the left palm from a kitchen fire in Billings 6 years back, permanently stained at the fingertips from the iron pots she lifted twice a day. Every day, without being asked and without being thanked. She wore her dark hair pulled tight because loose hair caught on things in a working kitchen, and she owned exactly 2 dresses that weren't aprons. She was not beautiful in any way the men at Iron Ridge would have noticed. She was simply there, filling the background of their days the way the stove and the wash basin were there. Useful, unremarkable, ignored. Bud Callahan was the one who set the tone. He was the ranch foreman, which meant Nathan Caldwell trusted him to manage the hands, the cattle, the daily operations, everything, essentially, that happened at Iron Ridge while Nathan was riding circuit to the other properties he owned in the valley. Bud was good at his job the way a hammer is good at hammering, effective, direct, and completely useless when what you needed was something other than a hammer. He was 47, had been working Montana ranches since he was 16, and he had never once in his life been wrong about anything, according to himself. He had also never liked Evelyn. She couldn't have told you exactly why. She'd done nothing to earn his hostility except exist in a space he apparently felt she had no business occupying. Some men were like that. They didn't need a reason. They just needed someone smaller than them to push against. That morning had started the way most mornings started at Iron Ridge. Evelyn had been up before 4, had the stove going by 4:15, had biscuits in the oven and salt pork in the pan before the first hand stumbled through the door. The bunkhouse kitchen was her territory, 12 by 14 feet of iron and wood and smoke, and she moved through it the way she moved through everything, efficiently, with minimal wasted motion, watching everything and being watched by nobody. She had been watching the sky for 3 days. It had started on Thursday, the way these things always started. Not with something dramatic, but with something small. The horses were off. Not spooked, not injured, just restless in a way that had no obvious cause, shifting in their stalls, eating less. Friday morning, she noticed the temperature had dropped 6 degrees overnight, but the wind had gone completely still, which was wrong. Wind didn't just stop in Montana in November. When it stopped, it was because something was gathering. Saturday, the sky started changing color at the edges. That particular sick yellow-green that looked almost pretty if you didn't know what it meant. She knew what it meant. She had seen it in Wyoming in 1887, the winter of the Big Die-Up, when 70% of the cattle in 3 territories froze or starved to death, and ranches that had been operating for 20 years went under in a single season. She had been 22 years old and newly married and living on a small spread outside Casper, and she had watched that storm come the same way she was watching this one come, with that particular stillness before it, that wrongness in the air, that sense of something enormous holding its breath. Her husband Robert hadn't listened either. He'd said she was worrying over nothing. He'd ridden out anyway to check the northern fence line. He'd come back 3 days later with frostbite on 4 fingers of his right hand that never healed right, and a cough that settled in his lungs and never fully left. He'd died of something else 6 years later, a horse accident, nothing to do with that winter. But Evelyn had never forgotten the look on his face when he came in from that storm. That specific expression of a man who realized, too late, that he should have listened. So on Saturday evening, when she finished cleaning up after supper, and the last of the hands had wandered back to the bunkhouse, she went to find Bud Callahan. She found him at the fence by the equipment barn, smoking, watching nothing in particular. "I need to talk to you about the weather," she said. He didn't turn around. "That right. There's a storm coming, a bad one, worse than anything this ranch has seen in, I'd guess 10 years at least. We need to move the cattle before—" "Evelyn." He said her name the way you'd say the word enough. "I don't need a cook telling me about cattle. I'm not talking about cattle. I'm talking about—" "I know what you're talking about." Now he turned. He had a broad, weathered face and small eyes that were good at conveying contempt without any other expression having to do any work. "You're talking about weather, which is something I've been reading for 30 years. And what I'm reading right now says we've got maybe a regular November cold snap coming in, nothing the herd can't handle if we bring them to the south pasture. The south pasture won't be enough. If this comes in the way I think it's coming in, then I'll deal with it when it gets here." He turned back to the fence. "Go on back to your kitchen." She stood there for a moment. She wasn't angry, or she was, but anger wasn't what she was feeling most. What she was feeling most was that particular tired dread of someone who has been in this exact situation before and knows exactly how it ends. "Bud." She kept her voice level. "I've seen this before. In Wyoming, 1887. That same sky, those same horses. Wyoming in 1887 was 40 years ago and 500 miles from here. We're done talking." She went back to her kitchen. She lay awake most of Saturday night doing the math. The storm, if she was right about what she was seeing, would hit sometime Sunday evening or Monday morning. That gave her maybe 36 hours. The cattle needed to be moved to the hidden canyon on the eastern side of the property, a narrow, sheltered ravine that cut between 2 ridges and blocked the northern wind almost completely. She had found it 3 months ago while gathering wild onions for soup, had noted it in the way she noted everything, quietly, without mentioning it to anyone, filing it away as the kind of thing that might matter someday. Someday was now. She couldn't move the cattle herself. She needed hands, and the hands took their orders from Bud. She went through her options the way she went through everything, systematically, without self-pity, looking for what was actually available rather than what she wished were available. She could go to Nathan, but Nathan was in Billings and wasn't expected back until Tuesday, which would be too late. She could try the hands directly, but without Bud's backing, they wouldn't touch the cattle on her say-so. She could try again with Bud, but that conversation was over. What she could do was everything else. Sunday morning, she started before anyone else was awake. She had a list in her head. She kept lists in her head the way other people kept them on paper, organized by priority and resource requirement. And she worked through it in order. First, water. She found every container in the kitchen and storage building that would hold water, and she filled them, covering them with boards to keep ice from forming on top. If the pipes froze, and they would, this would be what the men drank. Second, food. She pulled everything perishable into the root cellar and packed it against the cold, organized so she could find things in the dark. Third, the kitchen itself. She checked every windowsill, stuffed rags into the gaps along the bottom of the door, moved the extra firewood from the lean-to outside to the dry space under the kitchen counter where it would stay usable. She worked steadily, without rushing, because rushing caused mistakes, and she didn't have time for mistakes. At breakfast, she tried one more time. The hands were eating, 7 of them, ranging from Hector Delgado, who was pushing 60 and had been at Iron Ridge since before Nathan owned it, down to young Danny Pratt, who was barely 18 and had come up from Texas looking for ranch work. In between was Caleb Morris, 24, the loudest and most certain of all of them, the kind of young man who confused confidence with knowledge because he'd never yet been in a situation that taught him the difference. Evelyn set a plate in front of Caleb and said, as neutrally as she could manage, "That storm I mentioned to Bud yesterday is going to be here by tonight. Somebody needs to move the cattle to the Eastern Canyon." Caleb looked up. "You mentioned it to Bud?" "Yes." "What'd he say?" "He said no." Caleb shrugged and went back to eating. "Then I guess the cattle stay where they are." "If they stay where they are in what's coming, you'll lose half the herd by Tuesday." That got a few looks. Not the looks of men taking her seriously. The looks of men who found something mildly entertaining. "Half the herd," Caleb said, with that particular grin that young men who want an audience get when they think they've spotted something funny. "That's some storm." "Yes," she said, "it is. And you know this because I've seen one like it before." "In Wyoming." This was Bud's voice from the doorway. She hadn't heard him come in. "She's been in Wyoming." He said it the way you'd say she's been to the moon, with that tone of voice that turned a plain fact into a punchline. 40 years ago." The room laughed. Not all of it. Hector Delgado didn't laugh, just looked at his coffee, and Danny Pratt looked uncertain, like he was waiting to see which way the wind was blowing before he committed. But enough of it, enough to make the point. Bud walked to the coffee pot. "Nobody's touching those cattle without my say-so. We're bringing them to the south pasture this afternoon. That's the end of it." Evelyn picked up the biscuit plate to start serving the rest of the table. That was when Bud's hand shot out and caught the plate's edge. She had not seen it coming. One moment she was moving toward the table, and the next the plate was tilting, and she was grabbing for it, and Bud was watching her grab for it without any expression on his face, except something that might have been satisfaction. And then the plate was vertical, and the biscuits were falling, and there was that particular flat sound of Bud's boot coming down on one of them in the dirt. "Cook's job," he said, "is to cook." She looked at the biscuits on the floor. She looked at the boot on top of one of them. She looked at Bud's face. "Clean that up," he said. She cleaned it up. Nobody said anything while she did it. Hector Delgado set his coffee cup down with a careful quietness that wasn't quite protest, but wasn't quite nothing either. Danny Pratt stared at the table. Caleb Morris watched Evelyn pick biscuits up off the dirt floor with an expression she couldn't read and didn't try to. When she was done, she went back to the stove. She turned her back to the room, and she put the salvageable biscuits in a cloth and the ruined ones in the scrap bucket, and she stood there for a moment with her hands on the edge of the stove. She was not going to cry. She hadn't cried in the kitchen since Billings, and she wasn't going to start again over Bud Callahan and a plate of biscuits. What she felt, standing there, was something much simpler than sadness. It was the particular clarity that comes when all your options have been narrowed down to one. She had tried asking, she had tried explaining, she had tried reasoning. All of it had been taken away from her, not because she was wrong, but because she was who she was, standing where she was standing, in a world that had decided her kind of knowing didn't count. Fine. She knew what was coming. She knew what needed to be done. And if nobody was going to help her do it, she was going to do what she could do alone. And when the storm arrived, the things she had prepared would either hold or they wouldn't, and the men in this room would spend the next several days learning the difference between the kind of experience that makes noise and the kind that makes plans. She refilled the coffee pot. She started on the noon meal. And she worked through the rest of Sunday morning the way a person works who knows time is running out, steadily, completely, without wasting a single motion on anything that wasn't essential. At 10 o'clock, she slipped out the back of the kitchen and walked the eastern property line to the canyon. She needed to know the path well enough to walk it in the dark if it came to that, in snow if it came to that. She walked it twice, once in each direction, noting the landmarks, the footing, the places where the ground changed or the brush got thick. The canyon itself was exactly as she remembered, a narrow cut between two limestone ridges that turned the north wind into something deflected and diminished by the time it reached the low ground inside. It wasn't large enough for the whole herd, but it was large enough for the cattle that were most vulnerable. The calves, the older animals, the ones that had been running thin since September. She marked the entrance with a piece of her apron tied to a fence post. Then she walked back. At noon, she fed the men. Nobody looked at her directly. Bud ate fast and went back outside. Caleb Morris almost said something when she set his plate down. She could see it in the way his mouth opened and then closed. But he didn't, and she didn't give him an opening. By 2 in the afternoon, the sky had gone that particular wrong color all the way from north to south, horizon to horizon. Even Hector Delgado came and stood in the kitchen doorway without being invited and looked at it for a long moment without saying anything. "You've seen that before?" he finally asked. "Once," Evelyn said. "Wyoming, long time ago." He was quiet for a moment. "What happened?" "The cattle that weren't sheltered didn't make it." He looked at the sky. He looked at Evelyn. He looked at the sky again. He was a man who had been doing this work long enough to have his own kind of knowing, and she could see him weighing it, his own instincts against 30 years of doing what the foreman said. "Bud won't move them," he said. It wasn't a question. "No. I could talk to him again." "You'd be wasting your time." Another silence. The wind, which had been perfectly still for 2 days, had started moving again. Just a breath of it, barely enough to feel, but moving from the wrong direction, from the north-northwest, and cold in a way that had nothing to do with November temperature and everything to do with what was riding behind it. "The canyon," Hector said quietly. "The one on the east side." She looked at him. "You know it." "Found it years ago. Never had a reason to use it before." He was quiet a moment. "You've been out there today." It wasn't a question either. She thought about denying it, then decided there was no point. "This morning? How many head you think we can move without Bud noticing until it's done?" She had done this math at 4 in the morning. 12, maybe 14, the calves and the 2 older cows that have been favoring their back legs. The bull, if we can manage him. That's maybe a quarter of the herd. It's the quarter that won't survive the night in the south pasture. He stood in the doorway a little longer. Outside, the light was changing, going flat and strange the way it does when the sky closes down for something serious. "After supper," he said finally, when Bud's doing his evening check on the equipment barn. "Danny can help. The boy's got sense even if he doesn't know it yet." He went back outside. Evelyn turned back to the stove. She added more wood. She was going to need this fire going strong through whatever was coming. She checked her water supply. 6 large containers, covered, tucked against the wall that got the least cold air. She checked her food stores. She checked the window seals she'd stuffed that morning. Then she went back to cooking, because the men would need a full supper in them before tonight, and that was still her job. And she was still going to do it. You did what was in front of you. That was the thing she had learned across all the years and all the ranches, and the one bad winter that had taken Robert's fingers and left its mark on everything after. You did what was in front of you, completely, without saving yourself for something better, because the something better only came if you did the thing in front of you right. At 4:30, the first real gust hit the kitchen wall. Not a test gust, a declaration, the kind of wind that's been building for 3 days and has finally decided to stop holding back. Evelyn looked at the clock on the wall. She looked at the window. She put the bread in the oven and started on the soup. Supper was a quiet meal. The wind was already audible now, not howling yet, but present, pushing against the eaves of the bunkhouse in a way that even the least observant man in the room couldn't entirely ignore. Evelyn watched faces while she served. Caleb Morris was eating faster than usual. 2 of the other hands kept glancing at the door. Bud sat at the head of the table the way he always sat, with his arms taking up more space than they needed to. But she noticed he wasn't talking as much as he usually talked. Only Hector was eating at his normal pace, and only because Hector had spent 60 years learning how to not let his face say things his mouth wasn't saying. She caught his eye once, briefly. He gave the smallest possible nod. After. She started cleaning up. She moved slowly, deliberately, stretching the work out. Bud pushed back from the table at his usual time, pulled on his coat, and went out to do his evening check. The door closed behind him. Hector stood up. He looked at Danny Pratt and said very quietly, "Get your coat." Danny looked confused. Where are we? East pasture. We're moving some cattle. Hector was already at the door. Come on. Evelyn untied her apron. She hung it on its hook by the stove. She went and got her coat from the peg by the back door and put it on. Caleb Morris watched all of this from his seat at the table. His face went through several expressions in quick succession. Surprise, confusion, something that might have been the beginning of understanding. What's happening? He said. Nobody answered him. Hector and Danny were already outside. Evelyn pulled on her gloves, the heavy wool ones she kept in her coat pocket from October through April, and opened the back door. The wind hit her like a wall, full in the face, full in the chest, cold enough to pull the breath out of her lungs before she could properly draw it. She lowered her head and walked into it. Behind her, she heard the scrape of Caleb's chair. The path to the east pasture was a quarter-mile across open ground, and in the dark with the wind already serious, it felt longer. Evelyn walked it with her head down and her shoulders forward, and she felt the temperature dropping as she walked. Not gradually, the way temperature usually dropped after sunset, but in lurches, like steps down, like something was draining the warmth out of the air faster than the air could replace it. This was it. This was the storm taking a breath before the first real blow. She found Hector and Danny at the east pasture gate. They'd already gotten two of the hands' horses. She could hear them blowing and stamping in the dark. Hector had a lantern, the small one he kept in the equipment lean-to, and in its light his face looked older than usual, carved down to essentials. You lead, he said to Evelyn. You know the canyon entrance. I tied a marker, white cloth, fence post at the entrance. Good. He handed her the lantern. We'll work the cattle. You watch the marker. What happened next was neither smooth nor quiet. Cattle don't move easily in the dark, especially not in rising wind, and these cattle were already anxious. They could feel what was coming the way animals feel things that humans have to reason out. The calves were the worst, bunching and splitting at random, requiring twice the work for half the progress. The old bull took one look at where they were trying to push him and decided he had a different opinion about the matter. Danny Pratt got thrown twice. Once he got up cursing in a way that suggested he'd learned some words that hadn't made it into his regular vocabulary yet, and the second time he got up in silence, which was worse. Evelyn held the lantern and watched the path and called out when she saw something coming, a change in the ground, a drift of snow starting to gather along the fence line, the marker cloth at the canyon entrance whipping hard in the wind. She could feel the storm building behind her like a wall moving closer. Not yet, not the full force of it, but soon. They got 14 animals into the canyon in just under an hour. The calves, the two lame cows, 3 others Evelyn had flagged as thin, the bull finally, and 4 that had simply followed the others out of something like social instinct. Hector pulled the makeshift gate across the canyon entrance, just boards and rope, not elegant, but enough to keep them from wandering back out, and leaned against the fence post, breathing hard. That's what we've got time for, he said. That's what I needed to move, Evelyn said. He looked at her. The wind was loud enough now that they were half shouting, even standing 3 feet apart. The rest of them, he said. South pasture. The way Bud wanted it. She paused. They may make it. It's not certain they won't. It was as honest as she could be. She'd seen storms do different things to different herds. She'd seen cattle survive conditions that looked unsurvivable, but she'd also seen what the other outcome looked like. And she'd seen it in enough detail that she wasn't going to pretend it wasn't possible. Hector nodded. He pushed off the fence post. We need to get back before Bud finishes his check. They made it back with maybe 5 minutes to spare. Evelyn was back at the stove with her apron on and the morning coffee measured out when she heard Bud's boots on the bunkhouse steps. She didn't turn around. She heard him come in, heard him stamp the snow off his boots, snow that hadn't been there an hour ago, heard him go still. It's picking up, he said, to no one in particular. No one answered him. Evelyn added wood to the stove and kept her back to the room and said nothing at all. By midnight, the storm had arrived in full. She lay in her small room off the kitchen. Barely a room, really, a converted storage space with a cot and a hook for her coat and a window that gave directly onto the north wall, and listened to it work. The sound was extraordinary. Not just wind, but wind on top of wind. The high note and the low note, and something underneath both of them that was more felt than heard, a pressure that pushed against the walls as if testing them for weakness. She had tested them first. She knew where the weaknesses were. She had done what she could about the ones that could be fixed. She lay on her cot and she listened, and she did not sleep. Not entirely, but she rested, which was different, which was the thing she had taught herself to do in the years when sleep was a luxury and rest was a survival skill. She kept her coat on. She kept her boots near the cot. She had water in a covered pot on the small shelf above her head, and a candle and matches in her pocket. She was ready for morning. What morning looked like, she wouldn't know until it came. But she had done what she could do, and she had done it completely, and now the storm would be what it was going to be, and she would work with whatever remained when it passed. That was the only arithmetic that had ever made sense to her. You couldn't calculate your way out of a blizzard. You could only calculate your way into the best possible position before it arrived. And then you held on, and then you saw what you had. She had the canyon cattle. She had the water. She had the food stores, and the sealed windows and the extra firewood. She had done the math at 4 a.m. 3 days ago, and she had spent every hour since then making sure the numbers were right. Now she lay in the dark and listened to the storm, and she waited to find out if she had gotten it right. The storm didn't announce itself in stages. It arrived all at once, the way catastrophe usually does, not as a gradual worsening, but as a sudden crossing of some invisible threshold where the world on one side of it was merely dangerous, and the world on the other side was something else entirely. Evelyn heard it happen. She was on her cot, still dressed, and she felt the moment the wind shifted from serious to structural, a change in the pitch of it, a deepening, the way a sound goes from loud to physical, from something your ears process to something your whole body processes. The walls of the bunkhouse moved, not collapsing, not failing, but flexing in a way that walls aren't supposed to flex. And in the half-dark of her small room, she lay still and listened and counted. The stovepipe was holding. The windows she'd sealed were holding. The firewood under the counter was dry and accessible. She got up at 5, an hour before she normally would have, because there wasn't going to be anything normal about this day, and she might as well stop pretending there was. The kitchen was cold, not dangerously cold. The stove had banked through the night, and there were coals still, but cold enough that her breath made shapes in the air when she opened the storage room door. She got the fire going in 3 minutes. It was one of those skills that lived entirely in her hands, no thinking required. Kindling placement, paper, the single long match, the careful arrangement of the first small logs to give air underneath. She'd been starting fires since she was 8 years old, and she could do it in conditions that would defeat most men. She had water boiling by 5:20. At 5:45, she heard the first voices in the bunkhouse, men waking to the sound of the storm hitting the walls and finding it a different experience than falling asleep to it had been. There was something uniquely disorienting about waking into a blizzard after sleeping through its arrival. You closed your eyes in one kind of world and opened them in another, and your body needed a moment to adjust to the information that the rules had changed. She heard Bud's voice first, loud and flat. She couldn't make out the words through the wall, but she could hear the register of them. Not panic. Bud wasn't a man who panicked, but something compressed and forceful that meant he was already trying to manage what he was seeing. Then she heard boots on the bunkhouse floor, several sets of them, moving fast. She poured the first coffee and waited. Caleb Morris came through the kitchen door like something was chasing him, which, in a sense, it was. He was already half-dressed, coat over long underwear, boots, but no hat. And his face had that particular expression of a young man whose confidence has just taken a serious hit and isn't sure yet how to carry itself. He stopped when he saw Evelyn at the stove, the coffee steaming, the kitchen warm. "When did you—" He stopped, looked at the stove. "You've been up?" "Yes." "How long?" "An hour." He stood in the doorway a moment, looking at the coffee, and then at her, and then at the window, which showed nothing because there was nothing to show, just white, solid white, as if the glass had been painted overnight. "It's bad," he said. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't entirely directed at her. It was the kind of thing you say when you need to hear yourself say it, so it becomes real. "Yes," she said. "It is." He came to the counter and picked up a cup without asking. She didn't comment. He poured his own coffee and stood there holding it, and she could see him doing some private reckoning, going back over the last 2 days, measuring something. "The cattle," he said finally. 14 are in the eastern canyon. The rest are in the south pasture, where Bud put them. He looked up. "You moved cattle last night." Hector and Danny helped. Another silence. He drank his coffee. It was quiet between them, in the way that's quiet when two people are in the same room with a large, unspoken thing, and neither of them is sure yet who's going to be the one to acknowledge it. "I should have listened to you," he said. She turned back to the stove. "Drink your coffee. There's going to be a lot of work today, and you need something in you first." He almost said something else. She heard him draw breath for it. But he didn't, and she didn't push. And a minute later, Hector and Danny came in behind him, and the kitchen got small and warm and busy in the way it got when everyone needed the same small space at the same time. Bud came last. He filled the doorway the way he always did, and he looked at the coffee, and he looked at the window, and he looked at Evelyn, and his face did something complicated that she didn't try to interpret. "How are the water supplies?" he said. It wasn't an apology. It was something more practical than an apology, and she respected it more for that. 6 large containers covered against the south wall. Pipes will freeze inside 2 hours if they haven't already. He nodded. "Food?" 3 days. Easy. 5 if we stretch it. "Generator?" "That's yours to check. I don't know its condition." He looked at her for a moment. Just a moment, not long, but the kind of look that's doing work. Then he turned to Caleb. "Get dressed and get to the generator shed. I need to know if it's still running." Caleb went. Bud poured his own coffee and stood there drinking it and looking at the white window and not talking. And nobody in the kitchen talked either, because sometimes there's nothing to say, and the people in the room all know it and are decent enough not to fill the space with noise anyway. Outside, the storm was doing things to sound. When Caleb opened the bunkhouse door to go to the generator shed, they all heard it for a moment. Not wind so much as the absence of everything that wind normally displaces. No birdsong, no distant cattle, no creak of the normal world. Just the storm, filling every available frequency, crowding out everything else. Then the door closed and they had the kitchen back. Danny Pratt sat down at the table with his coffee and looked like he'd aged about 4 years overnight. There was a cut on his jaw from one of the falls in the dark. He'd cleaned it, but not well, and it had started to close wrong. Evelyn looked at it from the stove and made a mental note. "Does that hurt?" she asked. He touched his jaw. "Not much. I've got some salve in the storage room. Come find me later before it seals wrong." He nodded. He seemed surprised, in a way that suggested not many people had looked at his face closely enough to notice a cut on his jaw, and the surprise itself was its own kind of information about what his life had been like before he showed up at Iron Ridge. Hector sat next to him and drank his coffee in that careful way he had, both hands around the cup, methodical. He caught Evelyn's eye across the kitchen and gave her the briefest possible nod. The 14 head are there, the canyon held, and she gave him the same nod back. That was all that needed to be said between them. Bud set down his cup and started giving orders. He was good at this part. When the situation had simplified itself down to pure logistics, when there was no ambiguity to navigate and no one to argue with, he was genuinely effective. He assigned Hector to the cattle in the south pasture, 2 of the other hands to check and reinforce the equipment barn, Danny to the bunkhouse roof where snow was starting to load along the north-facing slope. "What about the east pasture?" Hector said. Bud looked at him. "South pasture first." "The east pasture cattle have already been moved," Hector said in a voice as neutral as stone. 14 head, in the canyon, last night." The room went very still. Bud turned slowly. He looked at Hector. He looked at Danny. He looked at Evelyn. She kept her eyes on the pot she was stirring. "Who authorized that?" he said. Nobody answered him. "I asked a question." "I made a decision," Evelyn said, to the pot. "About the animals most likely to die without shelter. Hector and Danny helped me execute it." The silence that followed was different from the other silences in the room that morning. It had an edge to it, a waiting quality, the silence of a situation that could go several different directions and hasn't decided yet which one. You moved cattle, Bud said, without my authorization. Yes. On my ranch. On Nathan Caldwell's ranch. It was the wrong thing to say and the right thing to say, and she knew both those things simultaneously as she said it. Wrong because it was the kind of precision that men like Bud experienced as a slap. Right because it was true, and truth had a way of cutting through even when it cut badly. She heard Bud draw a breath, a long one. When this storm passes, he said very quietly, you and I are going to have a conversation. Yes, she said. We are. He left the kitchen. The door didn't slam. That was almost worse than if it had. Bud Callahan closing a door quietly meant he was past the point of blowing off steam and into the place where he was working something out methodically, the way you work out a debt you intend to collect. Caleb came back from the generator shed with snow on his shoulders and frost in his eyebrows. The generator was running but rough. A bearing going somewhere, he said, probably had a week in it, maybe less. Heat the bunkhouse with the fireplace, Evelyn said. Don't run anything electrical you don't have to. Caleb looked at her, then at the door Bud had just gone through, then back at her. You know he's going to fire you when this is over, he said. Not cruelly, just factually, the way you'd tell someone their boot was untied. I know. He seemed to be waiting for more. Some qualification, some plan. She didn't give him one, because she didn't have one. She had done what needed doing. She had known when she did it that it might cost her the job. She'd made that calculation at 2 a.m. with the sound of the wind starting outside her window, and she'd made it the same way she made all her calculations. Clearly, without sentiment, looking at what was real rather than what was comfortable. She could live with being fired. She couldn't live with 14 dead calves. By 8 a.m, the storm had done something she hadn't entirely anticipated. It had gotten worse. Not the wind. The wind had reached some kind of plateau in the small hours and leveled off there. But the cold had dropped another 15 degrees since sunrise, which was extraordinary, which was the kind of temperature drop that killed things. Pipes that might have survived a normal blizzard were not going to survive this one. Cattle in the south pasture that might have huddled and endured were not going to endure this. She knew it when she went to refill a water container from the kitchen pump and got nothing. The pipes in the kitchen had frozen solid. She turned to her stored water, 6 containers. She uncovered the nearest one, ladled water into the coffee pot, put it back. 30 minutes later, Hector came back from the south pasture. He came through the door and stood there dripping snow and ice. And he was 60 years old and had been working cattle in Montana for most of those years. And even with all that, his face when he came through that door was the face of a man who had just seen something he hadn't expected. 3 down, he said. 2 calves and an older cow. Couldn't get to them fast enough. Nobody said anything. The rest are grouping up, sharing heat. Might hold. He paused. Might not. Evelyn handed him a cup of coffee. He took it without looking at her. The canyon animals? He said. Fine. As far as I know, we'd have to go out to check. I'll go. Not alone. Caleb can come. He drank the coffee in 2 long swallows and set the cup down. You were right, he said, still not looking at her. About all of it. I know, she said. It doesn't help those 3. No. He pulled his coat tighter. It doesn't. That was the thing about being right when the stakes were real. It never felt the way people assumed it would feel. There was no satisfaction in it. There was only the ongoing count of what had been saved and what hadn't, and the knowledge that the gap between those 2 numbers was still being determined. Caleb and Hector went out to check the canyon. Danny Pratt spent the morning on the bunkhouse roof with a long-handled snow rake, knocking accumulated snow loose before its weight could do structural damage. It was cold, relentless work, and when he came in for the noon meal, his hands were shaking too badly to hold his fork properly. Evelyn wrapped them in cloths she'd warmed on the stovetop and didn't say anything about it except to tell him to eat first and go back up when he'd had 20 minutes to recover. You don't have to boss me around, he said, but without any conviction behind it. I'm not bossing, I'm suggesting. You can freeze your fingers off if you prefer. He ate. He went back up 20 minutes later. Bud spent the morning going between the equipment barn and the south pasture, doing what he could for the cattle still out there. She could track his movements by the cold that came in when the doors opened and closed, by the brief sounds of wind that followed him everywhere. He didn't speak to her again until noon, when he came in and sat at the table and she put food in front of him without comment, and he ate without comment and then said, to the table rather than to her, "How many you figure we'd have lost if they'd all stayed in the south pasture?" She thought about it. Hard to say. Depending on how long this holds, maybe 20%, maybe more. And the 14 in the canyon. They'll be fine. The canyon deflects most of the wind. As long as they've got each other for warmth, they'll hold. He didn't say anything else. He ate the rest of his meal and went back out. It was Caleb who came back from the canyon check with news that changed the temperature in the room. And not because of the cold he brought in with him. He came through the door at 2 in the afternoon and stood there for a moment before he spoke. And in that moment, Evelyn saw something in his face she hadn't seen there before. Not the quick, surface alertness of a young man performing competence. Something slower. Something that had been worked into him since last night, like metal that's been left in a fire long enough to change its properties. "The canyon's good," he said, "all 14 holding. There's a natural windbreak along the north face we didn't know about. They've grouped up against it. Danny was right about the cut, too." He glanced at Evelyn. "That cloth you tied on the fence post. We couldn't have found the entrance without it. Visibility out there is maybe 15 feet. She nodded. He sat down at the table. He pulled off his gloves and turned them over in his hands. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You owe those cattle an apology," Evelyn said. "I'm fine." He almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile. More the ghost of one, the shape of a smile on a face that hadn't quite decided it had permission to make one. "Yeah," he said. "I guess they won't hold it against me as long as they make it through. That's generally how it works with cattle." He sat there a moment longer. "How did you know?" "Not just that there was a storm. I mean, I believe you about Wyoming, and I believe you about the signs, but the canyon, the water storage, the food, you had all that ready before the storm even hit." Evelyn turned back to the stove. "You plan for what you know is coming, but nobody else knew. That's not the same as it not being knowable." She paused, measuring her words the way she measured ingredients. "Enough, not more. I've been watching this ranch for 14 months. I've noted where the water comes from and what freezes it, where the buildings are weak, where the land offers shelter. I do it the same way I do everything else. I just do it without telling people, because people don't generally want to hear what I've noticed." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the storm pushed against the walls. "We didn't ask," he said. "No." "Because you're the cook. Because I'm the cook." He turned his gloves over again. "That's a hell of a waste." It was such a plain thing to say, no drama in it, no performance, that it hit her differently than an apology would have. An apology would have been about his guilt. This was about the actual thing, the actual waste of it, and that acknowledgement meant more than any sorry could have. She didn't respond to it. She stirred the soup and she let it sit between them, and that was enough. By afternoon, the storm had been going 36 hours, and Iron Ridge Ranch had found its rhythms inside of it. The rhythms of people managing a crisis that has settled in for a stay and is no longer an emergency so much as a sustained situation requiring sustained attention. Danny on the roof, twice a day. Hector checking the south pasture cattle every 3 hours, coming back with counts that held steady, now at the original number -3. Caleb managing the equipment barn and the generator, nursing the rough bearing along with oil he found in a back corner, buying them another day, maybe 2. And Evelyn in the kitchen, constant, feeding everyone, managing the water, keeping the fire going, keeping track of the supply inventory in her head, with the ongoing precision of someone who had never had the luxury of assuming there would always be more of anything. On the second night of the storm, she sat at the kitchen table after everyone else had gone to sleep, and she did the numbers one more time. Water. Enough for 4 more days if they were careful, 2 if they weren't. Food. Solid. Firewood. Enough if the storm broke in the next 48 hours. Generator. 50-50 on whether it made it through. The weather itself she couldn't calculate anymore. It would break when it broke. All you could do was hold on until then and come out the other side with as much intact as possible. She was still sitting at the table when the kitchen door opened and Bud Callahan came in. 2 in the morning. She hadn't heard him moving in the bunkhouse, had thought he was asleep like the rest of them. He sat down across from her without being invited. He looked at the lamp between them. He looked at his own hands on the table. "The 3 we lost in the south pasture," he said. "That wasn't your fault," Evelyn said. "You couldn't have known the temperature would drop that fast." "I could have listened to you." "Yes." He didn't flinch at that. She gave him credit for it. "The other 14, he said, "are fine. Because of you." She looked at the lamp. "Because of me and Hector and Danny. Hector's been reading this land for 30 years. He just needed someone else to confirm what he was already half thinking." Bud was quiet. The wind pressed against the kitchen wall, persistent, looking for gaps. "I've been doing this work since I was 16, he said. "And I will tell you right now, I have never in my life been so completely wrong about something I was so completely sure of." Evelyn waited. "What I did with the biscuits," he said, and stopped. "I don't need you to say it." "I'm going to say it anyway." He looked up from the table. His eyes in the lamplight were tired in a way that went deeper than no sleep. Tired in the way of a man who has been carrying a certain version of himself for a long time and has just discovered that version doesn't hold up. "That was wrong. It was small. I did it because—" He stopped again, moved his hands on the table. "I don't have a reason that makes it anything other than what it was." "No," she said. "You don't." Another silence, the kind that cleans something out of the air between people. "I told you we'd have a conversation when the storm passed," he said. "You did." "I'm not going to fire you." She looked at him. "I was going to," he said. "I had it worked out. Insubordination, moved cattle without authorization, all of it. Nathan would have backed me." He paused. "But Nathan's going to come home to a ranch that's still standing, with 14 animals alive that should be dead because of what you did. And I can add, even when the math embarrasses me." Evelyn looked at the lamp for a long moment. "I don't need your forgiveness," she said finally. "I don't need you to be grateful. I need to be able to do my job without having food knocked out of my hands. That won't happen again." "I know," she said, "because if it does, I'll leave, and you'll lose the most useful person on this property." It was not a boast. It was a fact, stated the way she stated facts, directly, without apology, without softening. She watched him hear it and decide not to argue with it, which was the most honest response he could have given. "Fair enough," he said. He got up. He went to the stove and poured himself coffee that was 4 hours old and probably terrible, and he drank it standing up the way men drink coffee when they don't want to sit back down and admit they're having a conversation they didn't plan to have. "The water source you found," he said. "The one under the east pasture." She looked up. She hadn't mentioned that to anyone yet. "How do you know about that?" "Hector," he said. "He knows more than he lets on." "Most people do." Bud almost smiled. Just the edge of one, gone before it fully formed. "We'll talk about it when Nathan gets back." He set down the coffee cup. "Get some sleep. When there's something worth sleeping for." He went back to the bunkhouse. The door closed. Evelyn sat at the table in the lamplight for another few minutes, listening to the storm work itself through whatever it still had left to spend, and she thought about 14 animals breathing warm air in a canyon she'd found in September, and 3 animals she hadn't gotten to in time, and the particular arithmetic of a crisis that lands differently depending on where you're standing when it hits. She had been right. She had been dismissed. She had done the work anyway, and the work had mattered, and some of it had been enough and some of it hadn't been. And both of those things were true at the same time, and she was old enough not to need one of them to cancel out the other. She blew out the lamp. She felt her way to her room in the dark, by the feel of the walls and the sound of the stove ticking as it cooled. The storm was going to break. She could feel it in the wind, a change in the quality of it, an easing at the edges, the way something sounds different when it's running out of energy. Not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. And when it broke, there would be a ranch still standing on the other side of it. Battered, short 3 animals with a generator on its last legs and pipes that wouldn't be right until spring, but standing, The cattle in the canyon would walk out of there into whatever was left of the winter world, and they would be alive. She lay down on her cot with her coat on and her boots near, and she closed her eyes. She had done the math. The math had held. That was enough. The storm broke on the third morning, not dramatically, not with some final violent gust and then sudden silence. It unwound the way it had wound up, in stages, the wind dropping by degrees through the night, until by the time gray light started coming through Evelyn's north-facing window, there was something different in the sound of the world outside. Still cold, still white. But the pressure was gone, that constant pressing weight that had been pushing against the buildings for 2.5 days, and its absence felt almost loud in its own way. She was up before anyone else, same as always. The kitchen stove had held through the night, and she had it fed and climbing back to useful heat within 10 minutes. She uncovered the water containers. 4 of the 6 still had water. The other 2 had frozen solid despite everything she'd done, which meant the cold had been more serious than even her worst calculation. She chipped ice from the frozen ones and put it in the pot to melt. It would take time, but it would be water. Outside the kitchen window, the world was white in every direction. Flat white, blinding even in the pale morning light, broken only by the dark lines of fence posts where the drifts hadn't completely buried them. The bunkhouse roof had 2 feet of snow on it. The equipment barn had more. The path between buildings was gone entirely, replaced by an unbroken surface that gave no indication anything had ever been where it had been. She was measuring coffee when she heard the first sound that didn't belong to the ranch. It was faint, a horse maybe, or the creak of something moving through packed snow, and it was coming from the direction of the main road. She stood still and listened, and there it was again, closer this time, and then the unmistakable sound of a horse blowing hard from exertion and a man's voice saying something low and urgent to it. She went to the kitchen door and opened it. The cold came in like a hand. She stood in it and looked out and saw, coming around the bend in the drive that the drifts had nearly erased, a single horse picking its way through snow that came up to its chest in places. And on the horse, a man she recognized, even at this distance and in these conditions by the way he sat. Slightly forward, weight distributed like someone who has spent most of his life in a saddle and stopped thinking about it. Nathan Caldwell. 2 days early. She watched him work the horse through the last 100 yards of drifted drive. He was moving carefully, reading the ground under the snow, the way you had to in these conditions, finding the solid footing and staying on it. When he got close enough to see her standing in the doorway, he pulled up and looked at her for a moment, and then looked past her at the ranch. At the building still standing, at the smoke coming from the kitchen chimney, at the untouched white surface of the yard that was, in its own way, a kind of information. He expected to come home to disaster. She could see that in the first second, in the set of his shoulders as he rode in the way his eyes moved across the property, taking inventory before he'd even dismounted, the particular alertness of a man braced for bad news. "Mrs. Hartley," he said. He was looking at the buildings. "Mr. Caldwell." She stepped back. "Come in and get warm. I'll have someone see to your horse." He dismounted. He was a tall man, 52, with a rancher's lean build and hands that were permanent evidence of the work, scarred, thick-knuckled, weathered past the point where weather could do much more to them. He handed her the reins without quite looking at her, which was habit, the unconscious habit of a man who has been handing things to people who stand in doorways his whole life, and walked past her into the kitchen. She called for Danny, who was up and in the bunkhouse. She could hear boots on the floor in there, and handed off the horse and went back inside. Nathan was standing in the middle of the kitchen with his coat on and his hat in his hands, and he was looking at things. The water containers. The sealed windows. The firewood stacked under the counter. The organized storage visible through the open root cellar door. He was looking at it the way a man looks at something when he's trying to understand what he's seeing, not just the surface of it, but what it means, what it implies about the time and thought that went into it. "The buildings," he said, "all standing. The cattle." She said it straight. "We lost 3 in the south pasture, 2 calves and an older cow. The temperature dropped faster than anyone anticipated, and we couldn't get to them in time." He nodded slowly. She could see him doing the math of it. 3 animals against what the numbers might have been if the storm had hit a ranch that wasn't prepared. He didn't know those other numbers yet. The rest? 51 accounted for as of yesterday evening. 14 are in the Eastern Canyon. They'll be the easiest to recover. The ground in there will be cleaner. The others are in the South Pasture, and they came through mostly. A few will need attention. He looked at her directly now. He had gray eyes that were direct without being hard. The eyes of a man who had learned over 50 years that most problems benefited from being looked at clearly. The Eastern Canyon, he said. I moved them before the storm hit. 14 head, the most vulnerable. Hector helped, and young Danny Pratt. Bud authorized that? No. A silence. Nathan looked at his hat. He turned it in his hands. He know? He found out the next morning. We had a conversation. I imagine you did. He set the hat on the counter. Walked me through it. From the beginning. So she did. She stood at the stove because there was coffee to finish making, and that was still her job regardless of what else was happening. And she told him the whole of it. Not complaining, not editorializing, not asking for anything. She told him what she'd seen in the sky 3 days before the storm, what she'd told Bud, and how that conversation had gone, what she'd done with the water and the food and the windows. She told him about the biscuits on the floor, straightforwardly, just as it happened, without dwelling on it. She told him about the night move to the canyon and Hector's involvement and the temperature drop that killed the 3 in the South Pasture. He listened to all of it without interrupting. That was not nothing. Most men interrupted. Most men found a point in a story where they'd already formed their conclusion and stopped listening in order to start responding. Nathan Caldwell stood in her kitchen and listened to the whole thing, and when she was done, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "The biscuits." "It's done," she said. "Bud and I have come to an understanding." "Tell me anyway." She told him, plain as she'd told everything else. He listened with his hands flat on the counter and his face doing something controlled and careful. "That's mine to deal with," he said. "I'm not asking you to deal with it. I'm asking you not to make it worse by making it a bigger thing than it already is. The men have found a way to work together through something hard. That matters more right now than whatever happened with the biscuits." He looked at her. "You're telling me how to manage my crew. I'm telling you what I saw and what I think. You can do with it what you want." He almost smiled. "You're a particular kind of woman, Mrs. Hartley." "I'm a practical one." "Yes." He picked up the coffee she'd set in front of him. "You are." Bud came in 20 minutes later and found Nathan at the table. Whatever passed between them in the first seconds before anyone spoke was the kind of exchange that lives entirely in a look. Nathan's eyes saying, "I know," Bud saying yes, and then both of them setting it aside in the way that practical men set things aside when there's work to be done, and the work is more important than the accounting. 3 lost, Nathan said. 3, Bud confirmed. He sat down across from Nathan. He did not look at Evelyn. "The canyon animals will recover fine. The South Pasture herd needs a vet to look at 4 of them. Possible frostbite on the ears and feet. Nothing fatal, probably. Generator? Caleb says it's got maybe 2 days left, bearings going. I'll have one sent from Billings when the road clears." Nathan drank his coffee. "The water system? Mrs. Hartley's supply got us through. Pipes are going to need work." "Hector know pipe repair?" "Hector knows everything," Bud said, and there was something in the way he said it, not quite dry, not quite rueful, that contained its own admission about the category of things he had underestimated on this ranch. Caleb came in, then Hector, and the kitchen that had been Evelyn's alone for 3 days became a room full of men, in the way it was normally a room full of men, loud and overlapping and taking up space. Nathan asked questions and got answers, and the picture of the storm assembled itself in the room around the table, piece by piece. At some point, Hector said, "The canyon was Evelyn's idea. The whole thing, the path, the marker, the choice of which animals to move. We just helped carry it out." Nathan looked at Hector, then at Evelyn. "I know," Nathan said. "I want to make sure you know," Hector said, and there was an unusual firmness in it for a man who generally kept his certainties private. "Hector," Evelyn said, "I'm not done." He looked at Nathan steadily. I've been on ranches 40 years. I have never seen anyone read a situation the way she read that storm. Not just the weather, everything. The water, the food, the buildings, the path to the canyon. She had that all worked out before any of us understood what was coming. That's not Cook's work. He picked up his coffee cup. I don't know what you call it, but it's not Cook's work. The room was quiet. Evelyn stood at the stove with her back partly turned because she did not entirely trust her face in that moment, and she stirred something that didn't need stirring and waited for the moment to pass. Nathan said, "What do you call it, Hector?" "Running a ranch," Hector said simply. "That's what I call it?" Nathan was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Caleb shifted in his seat, and Danny studied his boots, and even Bud seemed to find the grain of the table suddenly interesting. "Mrs. Hartley," Nathan said. She turned. "When the road clears and I can get into town," he said, "I'd like you to sit down with me and go over the property. All of it. Everything you've been watching for 14 months. Everything you've noticed." She looked at him. "What for?" "Because I've apparently been running this ranch with one eye closed, and I'd like to open it." Bud said nothing. His jaw moved slightly, the way a jaw moves when a man is deciding not to say the thing he was about to say, and then deciding that the not saying of it is itself a kind of statement. "All right," Evelyn said, "when the road clears." The day was full of the work that follows a storm. The specific, grinding labor of putting things back in order when the order that was disrupted was never particularly neat to begin with. Danny and Caleb spent most of the morning shoveling paths between buildings, a job that would have seemed simple if the drifts hadn't reached 5 and 6 feet in places, and if the snow itself hadn't taken on the compressed, heavy texture that comes from days of wind packing it. Hector and one of the other hands went out to the south pasture and began the slow work of assessing the surviving cattle, checking feet, checking ears, checking eyes, looking for the signs of frostbite damage that might not be immediately obvious but would declare themselves in the coming days. Evelyn fed everyone. That was still what she did, and she did it without any sense that it was less than what it had been before. It was necessary work, and she did it well, and it mattered. She also, in the spaces between meals, began making a list. Not on paper. In her head, the way she always made lists, organized by category and priority. But this list was different from her usual inventory lists. This one was about the ranch. Everything she had noted in 14 months that had nothing to do with the kitchen. The flood zone near the northern fence. The soil degradation in the west pasture from poor cattle rotation. The water she'd found seeping through limestone under the east field in late September. A spring or something like one. Which meant a water source that didn't depend on the pipes that had just frozen solid. The weak joint in the equipment barn's east wall that had been showing stress since she arrived and would fail in another bad winter if no one addressed it. She organized it. She put it in order. She thought about how to present it to Nathan without either underselling it, treating it as trivial, the random observations of someone with nothing better to do, or overselling it in a way that would make him defensive about things that had been right under his nose. She had been doing this her whole working life. Managing not just the information itself, but the way information landed on the people who needed to receive it. It was a skill nobody had taught her, and nobody had named for her. It was just something you learned when your words were always being evaluated through a filter of skepticism before they were evaluated for their actual content. Nathan found her in the late afternoon, after the main push of the day's recovery work was done. He came into the kitchen and sat at the table without the full complement of the crew for the first time since he'd arrived, and he had a look on his face that was working through something. "Talk to me about Bud," he said. Evelyn set down the cloth she was using to dry dishes. "What about him?" "He told me what happened, with the biscuits, his version." "And?" "And I want yours. I gave you mine this morning. I want to know how you see him, as a foreman." She considered this. It was a question worth considering carefully because the honest answer was complicated and the dishonest answer would be easier and also less useful. "Bud is good at his job," she said, "in good conditions. He knows cattle, he knows equipment, he knows how to manage men who already know what they're doing. When a situation is inside the lines of what he's dealt with before, he handles it well. And when it's outside the lines, he doesn't update. He decides he already knows the answer, and he sticks with it past the point where it's working. Nathan was quiet. The biscuits were a bad moment, she said. But the worst problem isn't what he did to the biscuits. It's that he was wrong about the storm, and he knew he was wrong about the storm before it hit. And his response to knowing he was wrong was to find a way to make the person who was right into the problem instead of listening to her. That's a precise way to put it. It's what happened. He drummed his fingers on the table once, a single brief rhythm, something he did when he was landing on a decision. I'm not going to fire him. I know. I already told you I wasn't asking you to. He's good at what he's good at. I just need to be clear about where those limits are. He looked at her. And I need someone who can see what he misses. Evelyn picked the drying cloth back up. That sounds like a different job than cooking. It is. You're offering me a different job. I'm asking if you'd consider one. He leaned back in his chair. Not instead of what you do. Not right away. I'm not going to blow up the crew's understanding of how things work here all at once. That won't serve anyone. But a different kind of role. Management of operations. Working with Bud, not around him. He paused. With real authority. Not a title that doesn't mean anything. She put the dried cup on the shelf. She picked up another one. Why? She said. Because you saved a quarter of my herd and 2.5 days of supplies, and probably kept 2 or 3 of my men from serious cold injury with preparations you made on your own, without authorization against active resistance, in the 48 hours before the worst storm this ranch has seen in a decade. He said it without drama, just the plain statement of it. And because Hector has been working for me for 16 years, and he doesn't say things he doesn't mean, and what he said this morning he meant. Evelyn set down the cup. She was 43 years old, and she had been on 6 ranches in 20 years, and not one of them had ever offered her anything except the next meal to cook and the next season to survive through. She had stopped expecting this kind of offer so long ago that she'd forgotten she'd ever expected it. She had made a life of being useful without being recognized, and she had told herself, mostly she had believed it, that the useful part was enough, that the recognition was a luxury she didn't need. Standing in the kitchen with the drying cloth in her hand and Nathan Caldwell looking at her across the table, she found out that she had been both right and not entirely right about that. I have conditions, she said. I'd be surprised if you didn't. I keep the kitchen until you find someone to replace me there. I'm not leaving it empty. Agreed. I work with Bud, not for him. If we disagree, we bring it to you. Neither of us overrides the other unilaterally. That's fair. And you listen, not just to me, to everyone on this property who has something useful to say. Hector has been watching this land longer than either of us, and nobody asks him anything either. Nathan looked at her for a moment. You're negotiating on behalf of Hector. I'm negotiating for a ranch that uses what it has. Hector is part of what this ranch has. She held his gaze. So is Danny Pratt, for that matter, if someone bothers to find out what the boy is actually good at. He spent 3 days on that roof in the worst conditions this county has seen in 10 years. And he didn't complain once, and he did it right. Nathan was quiet for a moment. Something moved through his expression that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite admiration, but was in the neighborhood of both. All right, he said. We'll do it that way. She hung the drying cloth on its hook. I'll need to write some things down before our meeting about the property. Write them down, he said. I'll be here. She nodded. He pushed back from the table and stood up, and at the door he stopped and turned. Mrs. Hartley, the water you stored, the windows, the firewood under the counter. He paused. You had all of that done before Bud knew the storm was serious. Yes. When did you start? Saturday morning, when I talked to Bud and he said no. He looked at her. So you just kept going. Someone had to. He stood in the doorway for a moment with that on his face, whatever it was, a man in his 50s adding something up and not entirely comfortable with what the sum came to. Good night, Mrs. Hartley. Good night, Mr. Caldwell. The door closed. She turned back to the stove. She added the last wood of the evening and checked the damper and made sure everything that needed to be closed was closed, and everything that needed to stay open stayed open. Through the kitchen wall, she could hear the crew in the bunkhouse. Not the words, just the murmur and occasional laughter of men coming down from 3 days of sustained stress, the particular looseness that comes after a crisis, when the worst is finally, verifiably past. She heard Caleb's voice, louder than the others. She heard Danny's, different than it had been 4 days ago, a little lower, a little steadier, like something that had been burning green had started to season. She heard Bud say something short, and the room went briefly quiet. She heard Hector's voice just once, saying something she couldn't make out, and then a general sound that was agreement. She sat down at the kitchen table with a piece of paper she'd found in the storage room and a pencil stub, and she began writing the list that had been building in her head for 14 months. The flood zone, the pasture rotation problem, the Eastfield water source, the barn wall joint. She wrote it in the neat, compressed hand she'd developed years ago when paper was expensive and space was limited, putting down exactly what she knew and nothing she didn't. No padding, no inflation, just the plain record of what 14 months of paying attention had given her. She filled one side of the paper. She turned it over and kept going. The fire ticked in the stove. Outside, the Montana night was doing what it did after a storm, going deep cold and absolutely clear, the temperature dropping into the kind of range where you could see stars in detail that you never saw when the air had any moisture in it. She could feel it at the window even without opening it. 3 animals lost, 51 surviving. A ranch still standing that had every reason to be otherwise. She finished writing and set the pencil down and looked at the list. It was, she thought, 14 months of being invisible, distilled into both sides of a single piece of paper. Everything she had watched and filed and kept to herself because nobody had asked and she had learned not to offer. All the things she'd seen that no one else had seen, not because she was extraordinary, but because she had simply been paying attention every single day while everyone else was paying attention to something else. It didn't look like much, laid out like that, just a list, just words on paper. But she had watched 3 animals die in a South Pasture blizzard that 14 others survived in a canyon she'd found in September and marked with a piece of her apron, and she understood in a way that didn't require stating that the difference between those 2 outcomes lived entirely in the kind of watching she'd done and the kind no one else had bothered to do. She folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket. She blew out the lamp and went to her room and lay down on her cot with her coat on, same as she had every night for 3 nights. Except that tonight the wind outside was nothing, just the normal sound of air moving in a world that had stopped trying to tear itself apart. She lay in the dark, and she did not feel triumphant. She did not feel vindicated in any way that required an audience or a moment. What she felt was something quieter than either of those things. The particular steadiness of a person who did what they knew needed doing, paid the price they expected to pay for doing it, and came out the other side with the work intact. That was what she had. It was what she had always had. The difference now was that someone with the authority to change things had finally sat across a table from her and seen it for what it was. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow there was a ranch to put back together. Tomorrow she would sit down with Nathan Caldwell and a piece of paper and begin the work of making Iron Ridge Ranch into what it could be instead of what it had been. Tomorrow, Bud Callahan would have to navigate a reality that was going to require him to be a different kind of man than he'd been for 30 years. And that was going to be neither smooth nor simple, and she was going to need patience she didn't always have. But that was tomorrow. Tonight she had done enough. Tonight the ranch was standing, and the storm was over, and 14 cattle were breathing warm air in a canyon that nobody had thought to use until a cook, who nobody listened to, had walked out to gather wild onions one afternoon in September, and looked at the shape of the land and understood what she was looking at. She slept. The meeting with Nathan happened 4 days after the storm broke, when the road into town had been cleared enough for the supply wagon to get through, and the immediate crisis work had settled into the slower, grinding labor of genuine recovery. He came to the kitchen after supper, when the crew had gone back to the bunkhouse and the table was clear. He brought a ledger and a pencil and set them on the table without ceremony, and Evelyn brought the folded piece of paper from her coat pocket. She'd been carrying it there since the night she wrote it, and set it across from his ledger, and they sat down. He looked at the paper, both sides dense and small. He looked at it for a moment before he picked it up. "How long did it take you to write this?" he said. "About an hour. It took 14 months to know it. He read it through without speaking. She watched his face move through what it moved through. Surprise at the flood zone item, something more complicated at the pasture rotation problem, a long pause at the water source notation. He set the paper down. "The spring under the east field," he said. "You're certain?" "I'm certain there's water moving through that limestone. Whether it's accessible at useful volume, I don't know. That needs someone who understands wells. I know someone in Billings." He wrote something in the ledger. "The flood zone. Spring runoff, if we get the snowmelt I think we're going to get after a winter like this. The northern fence line sits in a natural depression. Water will pool there, and it'll take the fence posts with it. Needs to be moved 30 feet east before March." He wrote that down too. "You knew about this in November?" "September. I walked the northern boundary in September when I was looking for—" She stopped. "Wild onions," he said. She looked at him. "Hector told me," he said. "You walked the property lines, gathering food for the kitchen, and came back with 2 months of operational intelligence that nobody thought to ask you about." She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything useful to say. "That's on me," Nathan said. Not as a performance of remorse, just flatly, the way you'd state a fact about an equipment failure. "I've had the right person in the wrong role for over a year, and I didn't see it." "You weren't looking." "No, I wasn't." He made another note. "The barn wall. East joint, upper third. There's a stress crack that's been widening since at least October. Another winter like this one, and it goes." "Can Hector assess it?" "Hector already knows about it. Ask him." Nathan looked up. "He knows?" "He's been watching it since August. He mentioned it to Bud in September." She let that land. "Bud put it on the list for spring." The pencil stopped moving. Nathan set it down. "Bud put it on the list for spring," he repeated. "To be fair," Evelyn said, "it probably would have been fine in a normal winter. This wasn't a normal winter." "No." He picked the pencil back up. "It wasn't." They worked through the rest of the list methodically, Nathan asking questions and writing answers, and occasionally going quiet in a way that meant he was doing the math of what it had cost him to not have this conversation 14 months ago. She gave him what she had without elaborating beyond what was useful. She was not trying to make him feel the weight of it any more than the facts themselves already made him feel it. That wasn't the point of the meeting. When they were done, he closed the ledger and sat back in his chair and looked at her. "The role I described," he said. "Operations management. You've thought about what that looks like." "I've thought about what it can't look like," she said. "It can't look like me going around Bud. That poisons the crew, and it makes Bud useless, and Bud is not useless. It has to be collaborative, or it doesn't work." Bud's agreed to it. Bud agreed to it 4 days after a blizzard when he was still working out what had happened. Give him 3 weeks of normal operations, and we'll see what he's actually agreed to. Nathan looked at her steadily. "You don't trust that it'll hold." "I don't trust anything I haven't seen hold yet. That's not pessimism. It's just sense." "What do you need to make it work?" She had thought about this too. "A clear agreement about who decides what. Not a conversation, a defined structure. Bud handles the crew and the daily cattle work. I handle property operations, resource planning, and anything that involves looking more than 2 weeks out. Disagreements come to you. No one overrules the other on their own ground without your say-so." He nodded slowly. "That's reasonable." "I know it is. I wrote it." He almost smiled. "I'll talk to Bud." "Don't tell him I wrote it?" "Why not?" "Because he'll spend the first month looking for ways to renegotiate it instead of trying to make it work. Let him think it came from you. He'll own it better." Nathan looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. It was somewhere between appreciation and the mild discomfort of a man realizing he's talking to someone who understands people better than he does. "You've been managing men your whole career," he said, "without any authority to do it with." "You manage what you have," she said. "I didn't have authority, so I used other things." "Like what?" "Like making sure everyone was fed and warm before I needed them to listen to anything I said. Like noticing what each person was actually good at and finding ways to put them near those things. Like keeping my mouth closed about 2/3 of what I knew, because knowing everything and saying everything are not the same skill and most people can't tell the difference. He was quiet for a moment. That last one. The one where I only said a third of what I knew. Yes. How did you decide which third? She considered that. It was a better question than she'd expected. The third most likely to be heard. The third that, if acted on, would make the biggest difference. The third I could prove, not just see. And the other two-thirds stayed with me. She paused. Some of it is on that paper. He looked at the piece of paper again. She could see him understanding, for the first time maybe, that this wasn't the whole of what she knew. It was the part she'd decided to hand over. The rest was still filed away somewhere in a mind that had been doing this kind of work for 20 years in rooms where it was never acknowledged. The conversation with Bud happened 2 days later, and Evelyn was not in the room for it. She was in the kitchen when it took place, but the bunkhouse wall was not thick, and Bud's voice, when he was working to keep it controlled, had a particular carrying quality that he probably wasn't aware of. She didn't hear everything. She heard enough. She heard Nathan's voice, low and level. She heard Bud's, measured at first and then lifting and then controlled again. She heard a silence that lasted almost 2 minutes, long enough that she'd started to wonder whether something had broken in there. And then Bud's voice again, different this time, the way a voice sounds when it's finished arguing and moved into something else. She heard Nathan say her name once. Then Bud said something she couldn't make out. Then Nathan again. Then nothing for a while. Then Bud came through the kitchen on his way to the equipment barn without looking at her, and his face was the face of a man who has just agreed to something that required him to be larger than his habits, and is in the process of deciding whether he is actually that large. She kept her eyes on the stove. 15 minutes later, Nathan appeared in the doorway. "It's settled," he said. "How is he?" "He'll be fine. He's a stubborn man, but he's not a stupid one." He paused. "He said to tell you," and I'm quoting this exactly because I want to get it right, "that he still thinks a woman running operations on a cattle ranch is going to cause more trouble than it solves, but he's willing to see it proved wrong." Evelyn nodded. "That's fair. You're not offended by that?" "It's honest. I'd rather have his honest doubt than his dishonest agreement. I can work with doubt. It's the dishonest kind I can't see coming." Nathan looked at her the way he'd been looking at her since he'd gotten back, like someone constantly catching up with something. "When can you start?" "I've been doing it for 14 months, she said. "I'm just doing it out loud now." The first weeks were neither the disaster Bud feared nor the clean beginning Evelyn might have wished for, which meant they were exactly what she'd predicted they would be: complicated, human, and mostly workable. The structural disagreements came first, because structural things always did. The West Pasture cattle rotation was the main one. Evelyn had laid out the problem in her notes: overgrazing on the eastern section, soil compaction, degraded root structure, and proposed a rotation that would rest the eastern third through the spring and move grazing pressure westward. Bud had been rotating the same way for 6 years. He had his reasons, and they weren't bad reasons, but they were 6-year-old reasons applied to a pasture that was no longer in the same condition it had been when he made them. She brought it to Nathan. She brought the soil she'd sampled from 3 locations in the eastern pasture, scooped into a tin cup months ago, labeled, kept in the storage room. She brought her notes on the plant coverage from September observations. She did not bring Bud's counter-argument to Nathan, because that was Bud's to bring. Bud brought it. Nathan listened to both. He asked 2 questions of each of them and then made his decision in favor of the rotation change, and the way he did it was careful enough that Bud could accept it without it feeling like a defeat. He framed it as a trial, 3 months, with a review of the pasture condition afterward. Which meant if it worked, and if it didn't, Bud had a path back to his method without losing face. Evelyn had suggested this framing to Nathan beforehand. She had not told Bud she'd suggested it. "You do a lot of that," Caleb said to her one afternoon, about 3 weeks into the new arrangement. He'd taken to coming around the kitchen at odd hours, not just for coffee, she'd realized, but for something else she didn't have a name for yet. "A lot of what?" she said. "Setting things up so they come out the way you want them to, but in a way that nobody notices you set them up." She looked at him. He was leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, and his expression was the expression of someone working out a puzzle they've been looking at for a while. "Is that a complaint?" she said. "No." He uncrossed his arms. I'm trying to learn it. She turned back to what she was doing. What do you want to learn it for? Because I'm 24 and I've been doing things loudly my whole life and it doesn't work as well as I thought it did. She was quiet for a moment. You want my advice? I want to know how you think. You can't learn how someone else thinks. You can learn what questions they ask. She kept working while she talked, because she always worked while she talked, and he was going to have to be comfortable with that. The question I ask first is always, what actually needs to happen here? Not what do I want to happen? Those are different questions, and most people spend their whole lives treating them like they're the same question. He chewed on that. What's the second question? Who has to be willing for the thing to happen? And what do they need to be willing? She glanced at him. That's where most people stop thinking. They figure out what they want and who's in the way of it, and they either fight that person or go around them. But going around someone doesn't make them willing. It just makes them unaware. And eventually they become aware. And then you have a bigger problem than the original one. That's what you were doing with Bud, with the rotation. I was making it possible for Bud to be right about something even while being wrong about this particular thing. Because if he can't be right about anything, he's got nothing to lose by fighting everything. Caleb stood there a moment longer. Where'd you learn all this? Everywhere that wouldn't teach me anything else, she said. He laughed. A real one, not performed. She hadn't heard him laugh like that before. It made him look younger and less guarded and more like whatever he actually was underneath the performance of certainty he'd been running since she met him. I was awful to you, he said. In the beginning. You were 24 and nobody had corrected you yet. That's generous. It's accurate. Generous would be saying it wasn't your fault. It was your fault. You just had a lot of company. He nodded. He picked up his coffee cup. At the kitchen door, he stopped. For what it's worth, he said, I'm glad you didn't leave. I wasn't going to leave, she said. I still had work to do. He went out. She heard him cross the yard whistling something tuneless, the way young men whistle when they're thinking about something they're not ready to put into words yet. The flood zone repair was the first project she ran entirely herself. It had to happen before the snowmelt, which gave her a window of maybe 3 weeks. She mapped it with Hector. They spent a cold afternoon walking the northern fence line with stakes and rope, marking where the line needed to move and how far. Hector had 40 years of reading that kind of terrain, and his instincts confirmed her survey, which confirmed his instincts, and they worked together in the comfortable efficiency of people who have both been paying attention to the same things from different angles for a long time. Getting the crew to do the actual work was Bud's domain, and this was the part she'd been most uncertain about, whether Bud would follow through on paper agreements when the reality of taking direction from the operations framework she represented arrived in daily practice. He did. Not cheerfully. She didn't need cheerful, but consistently. He assigned Caleb and 2 of the other hands to the fence move, gave them the equipment they needed, checked their work at the end of the first day. When one of the hands, a man named Garrett, mid-30s, the most openly resistant to the new arrangement, came to Bud with a complaint about following a relocation plan that the cook had drawn up, Bud said something to him in a voice too low for Evelyn to hear, and Garrett went back to work and didn't bring it up again. She asked Hector later what Bud had said. He said the cook drew it up with better survey tools than you've got in your head, so unless your head grew a level and a compass since yesterday, get back on the line. Hector's expression didn't change when he said it, but something in his eyes was quietly satisfied. That's almost a compliment, Evelyn said. From Bud? That's a love letter. She laughed, actually laughed, which surprised her a little. Not the feeling of it, but the sound, which came out more freely than she'd expected in a kitchen she'd been quiet in for 14 months. The fence was moved in 4 days. When the snowmelt came 6 weeks later, the northern section drained exactly as she'd predicted. The old fence line was underwater for 11 days. The new one stood dry. Nathan rode the line after the water receded. He came back and found Evelyn in the storage room doing inventory. 11 days, he said, about what I expected. The old posts would have gone. All of them. And likely taken 20 feet of line on either side. He stood in the doorway of the storage room watching her count tins. The water source under the east field, My man from Billings is coming next week. Good. Dig in the third week of April. The ground should be soft enough by then. If it's what you think it is, it's something. What it is exactly, I don't know yet. She moved a tin to the counted stack. Don't build your plans around it until we know. Fair. He paused. Bud told me the fence move went well. She looked up. He didn't phrase it as a compliment, Nathan said. He said the survey was sound and the execution was clean. From Bud, that's... Hector already explained Bud's compliment scale to me. Nathan smiled. A real one. It changed his face, made it younger, showed something underneath the rancher's weathered practicality that had been put there before all the weathering happened. You've made him better, you know, not just the ranch, but himself. I've given him something to push against that pushes back in a useful direction, that's all. You think that's all? I think that's what I can see. What's happening in his head is his business. What was happening in Bud's head was, she suspected, more complicated than either of them was stating. He had come to the new arrangement as a man who'd agreed to something under pressure, and he was discovering, she could see it happening, week by week, that the pressure had put him somewhere he hadn't expected to want to be. He was working harder, not longer hours. Shh. He'd always worked long hours, but more carefully. She would catch him looking at the property sometimes with a quality of attention he hadn't brought to it before, as if having someone else who was watching had made him watch differently too. He still didn't like her exactly, but it had become a different kind of not liking, complicated, with respect underneath it, the way you can not like a thing that has nonetheless proved itself useful and true. One evening in late April, she was at the kitchen table after supper with her papers when Bud came in, which was not something he usually did voluntarily. He poured himself coffee and sat down across from her and looked at what she was working on. It was a pasture plan for the summer, rotation schedules, cattle numbers per section, rest periods, projected carrying capacity based on the spring regrowth she'd been measuring in the western fields. He looked at it for a while without speaking. She let him look. The carrying capacity estimate on the south section, he said finally. You've got it lower than last year. It was overgrazed last fall. It's recovering, but it's not there yet. Run the same numbers as last year and you'll see the regrowth stall out by August. He was quiet. How do you know the regrowth timeline? I've been measuring it since March. Root depth, ground cover density, moisture retention. Same method I used for the east section diagnosis. He turned his coffee cup on the table. Around and around, a slow rotation, while he thought. You were measuring the pastures in March, he said, in the cold. I walk the property most mornings. I have for 14 months. He stopped turning the cup. I didn't know that. You didn't ask. Another silence. This one had a different texture than the early silences between them. Less guarded, less loaded. More like the silence between two people who have established enough of a history together that they don't need to fill every gap. If the south section carrying capacity is what you're saying it is, he said slowly, we should pull the herd off it 2 weeks earlier than I planned. Yes. And move them where? The canyon pasture, if the well comes in the way I think it will, or the upper north section if it doesn't. He looked at the paper. He looked at the pasture plan. He reached out and put a finger on the south section notation and moved it across the page to the upper north section box. August 1st, he said, not the 15th. August 1st, she agreed. He picked up his coffee and finished it and stood up. At the door he did something she hadn't expected. He turned around, not to say anything, and he just turned and looked at her for a moment, at the table and the papers and the woman who had been doing this in her head for over a year with nowhere to put it. His expression was not warm, exactly, but it was clear in a way it hadn't been clear before. A man looking at something without the filter of what he'd decided it was before he looked. Then he went out. She sat at the table for a moment after the door closed, listening to his boots cross the yard. Then she picked up her pencil and went back to work. The well came in on the 22nd of April. Not dramatically. Nathan's man from Billings dug where Evelyn had marked, hit limestone at 4 feet, and found moving water at 11. Not a flood, not a gusher, but a consistent seep through fractured rock that with a proper casing and pump would produce 30 to 40 gallons an hour. In Montana, drought conditions, 30 to 40 gallons an hour, was the difference between a section that could carry cattle through a dry August and a section that couldn't. Nathan rode out when the man from Billings gave him the report. He stood at the dig site looking at the water pooling in the bottom of the test hole, and he stood there for a while without saying anything. Evelyn stood next to him. "September," he said finally. "You found this in September." "Gathering wild onions," she said. He looked at her sideways, the wild onion gathering. "I cook what this land provides. I have to know what the land provides. And in the process of knowing what the land provides for the kitchen, you also noticed a subsurface water source that could carry the east section through drought conditions for the next 20 years. I noticed water seeping from limestone and filed it away as something worth investigating. Your man from Billings did the actual work." Nathan shook his head slowly. "You are the most careful person I have ever met about not claiming more than you should. I've spent 20 years having people claim I thought more of myself than I should. I've overcorrected." He looked at her. Something in his face was working through something larger than the well, larger than the fence, larger than the storm that had started all of this. She could see him assembling the picture of it, not just the individual items, but the shape of the whole thing, the years of watching and knowing and keeping it contained in a kitchen because there had been nowhere else to put it. "I've been thinking about something," he said, "since we had that first meeting, about the 2/3 of what you know that's still not on any piece of paper." She waited. "What would it take," he said, "to get the rest of it?" She looked at the water in the hole, clear, cold, coming from somewhere deep in the rock that it had been moving through long before any of them arrived here. "Time," she said, "and for people to keep asking." "I'll keep asking." "Then you'll get the rest of it." She turned away from the well. "A few things at a time, the same way I learned them." She walked back toward the kitchen, and behind her she heard Nathan say something to the man from Billings about casing specifications and pump costs, the practical machinery of turning what she'd found into something the ranch could use. That was how it worked. She found things, and other people built around them, and the ranch got stronger, and that was what she had come here to do. Even before anyone had given her permission to do it, even when the only person who knew she was doing it was herself. The kitchen door opened under her hand. The smell of the afternoon fire and the coffee that was still warm on the stove came out to meet her. She went in. She fed the fire. She started on supper. Outside, the April sun was doing what April sun did in Montana when winter had finally, genuinely let go, hitting the snowmelt ground at a low angle, pulling the first color out of the grass that had been brown and dead-looking since October, finding the green underneath that had been waiting the whole time. The east pasture caught it. The canyon caught it. The northern fence line, 30 feet east of where it used to be, standing dry on solid ground, caught it and held it. She could see all of it from the kitchen window. She could always see everything from the kitchen window. That had never been the problem. The well pump arrived from Billings on a Thursday in early May, loaded on the back of a wagon with a hand-crank casing tool and 50 feet of pipe, and a man named Gus, who smelled like machine oil and had opinions about everything. He took 4 days to install it properly, complaining the entire time about the limestone depth and the angle of the fractured seam and the inadequacy of the ground conditions. And on the 4th day he primed it and pumped the handle, and clean cold water came up out of the Montana earth at a rate that made even Gus go quiet for a moment before he found something new to complain about. Evelyn was there when it came in. She'd been there every day of the installation, not hovering. She didn't hover, it wasn't in her, but present. Learning the mechanism, understanding how the casing seated against the rock, where the pump seals were, what would fail first and in what sequence if it wasn't maintained. She asked Gus questions, and he answered them with the particular condescension of a specialist who has been asked questions by people he considers unqualified, but his answers were good, and she retained them entirely. "You going to be the one maintaining this?" he asked on the last day with a tone that suggested he considered this suboptimal. "I'm going to make sure someone knows how," she said, "whether that's me or someone else." He looked at her over the pump handle. "You know what this is, what you found here? Water. 40 gallons an hour of water in a region that goes dry by July most years." He wiped his hands on a cloth that was already beyond helping. "That's not nothing." "I know it's not nothing." Ranches have failed out here for less than not having this. He looked at the pump, at the pipe disappearing into the ground, at the water still dripping from the last test stroke. How'd you find it? I was looking for something else, she said, and I paid attention to what I found instead. He considered that. You the cook here? I'm the operations manager. He looked at her, then at the pump, then back at her, with the expression of a man recalibrating something. Huh, he said, and went to pack his tools. The summer that followed was the summer Iron Ridge Ranch started becoming something different from what it had been, and the change was visible in the kind of way that changes are visible when they're real, not in any single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of smaller things that add up differently than they used to. The South Pasture cattle came off the section on August 1st, exactly as Evelyn and Bud had settled on that April evening at the kitchen table. The regrowth stalled in the second week of August, precisely where she'd predicted it would stall, which meant the cattle were already on better ground and the south section got 3 weeks of recovery it wouldn't have gotten under the old schedule. Bud watched this happen without saying much. She watched him watch it. Sometime in the middle of August, she noticed he'd started making his own notes. A small, leather-covered book he kept in his shirt pocket, recording things she wouldn't have expected him to record. Pasture conditions, water table observations from the new pump, the weight of individual cattle at monthly intervals. He didn't mention the notebook. She didn't mention it either. Some things were better left to grow on their own. Caleb Morris was the one who brought her the first outside visitor. It happened in late July, a rancher from the next valley named Horace Webb, who ran 300 head and had been struggling with a water situation similar to what Iron Ridge had dealt with before the well came in. Caleb had ridden over to Webb's place on an errand for Nathan and had apparently talked more than he'd been sent to talk because Webb showed up 2 weeks later asking to see the pump installation and the pasture rotation plan. He sat at the kitchen table, Evelyn's kitchen table, which had become the unofficial meeting room for anything operational at Iron Ridge in a way that nobody had formally decided. And he asked his questions, and she answered them, and he left with a copy of her rotation schedule and the name of Gus from Billings. You didn't have to give him all of that, Nathan said afterward. Why not? It's proprietary. Things we figured out took time and money. It's land management, she said. If his operation does better, his cattle are healthier, the whole valley does better. We're not competing with our neighbors for water tables. The water table doesn't know where his property ends and yours begins. She paused. And he'll tell people where he got the information. Nathan looked at her. That's not entirely selfless. Nothing is, she said. The question is whether the self-interest aligns with doing the right thing. In this case, it does, so there's no problem. Horace Webb came back in September with 2 other ranchers. Then in October, 3 more. By the time the first anniversary of the storm had come and gone, Evelyn had sat at that kitchen table with 9 different ranchers from 3 different valleys, and every single one of them had come because someone else had told them to come, and every single one of them had left with something useful. Nathan stopped questioning why she gave information away freely. He'd done his own version of the math. The first anniversary of the storm landed on a Tuesday in November, and the day itself was unremarkable. Cold, clear, the kind of Montana day that would have been beautiful if you had time to look at it, which on a working ranch you generally didn't. Evelyn made breakfast and fed the crew and walked the property lines in the morning, the way she walked them every morning, checking what needed to be checked. She walked past the northern fence line, the new northern fence line, 30 feet east, standing solid on dry ground with the old line's ghost visible in the dead grass where the posts had been pulled. She walked the east pasture and checked the pump housing, which had developed a small frost crack in the casing that would need to be addressed before the deep cold came. She made a note. She walked the south pasture and pulled up a handful of earth at the southeast corner and looked at its texture, its color, the way it held together, and compared it to the handful she'd pulled from the same spot in March. The difference was not dramatic. It wouldn't look dramatic to anyone who hadn't been pulling soil samples from this particular spot at regular intervals for 8 months. But it was there. A deepening in the color, a slight change in the cohesion of it, the beginning of something that had been depleted starting to come back. It would be 2 more years before that section was fully recovered. She'd told Nathan 2 years from the start, and she still meant it, and she was still going to be here to see it. That last thought arrived without announcement, and she stood in the south pasture holding a handful of Montana dirt and let it be true. She was going to be here. That was not a small thing. She had lived a working life of being somewhere until she wasn't, moving on when the work ran out or the welcome wore thin or the situation became untenable, carrying everything she knew in her head because it was the only storage that moved with her. She had not let herself plan past the next season since Robert died. Planning past the next season required believing you'd be somewhere to carry the plan out, and that belief had been a luxury she couldn't afford. She could afford it now. She put the dirt back where she'd taken it from. She kept walking. Hector was at the equipment barn when she came back through, doing something to a piece of harness that required sitting down and working slowly and deliberately, which was how Hector did everything that mattered. He looked up when she passed. "South section?" he said. "Better than March, still 2 years out." He nodded. He went back to the harness. She stopped. She stood there in the thin November sunlight and looked at him. 60 years old, white-haired, hands that had been doing this work since before she was born. And she thought about what it cost to know things for 60 years in a world that only asked you what you knew when it had already run out of other options. "Hector," she said. "Do you ever get tired of it, knowing what you know and having it sit there unused?" He didn't look up right away. He worked another stitch in the harness. Then he set it on his knee and looked at her with the particular quality of attention he brought to things he'd thought about before. "Every year until about 3 years ago," he said. "Then I got old enough to stop waiting for permission." He picked the harness back up. "You got there faster than I did." "I had a storm to help me." "You had yourself to help you. The storm was just the occasion." She stood there a moment longer. "Thank you," she said, "for that first night, moving the cattle." "You thanked me already." "I know. I'm thanking you again." He looked up. "You know what I would have done if you hadn't figured it out?" he said. "If you'd been wrong about the storm and the canyon and all of it?" "Gone back to the south pasture with the rest of them." "Gone back to the south pasture," he confirmed, "and probably lost more than 3 head." He paused. "That's the part nobody talks about. What would have happened if you hadn't been right? They want to say you got lucky, like the knowing was luck." "Let them say it." "I don't let them say it. That's the difference between you and me. I let it go, and you don't." She thought about that. "I let a lot of things go." "You let the small things go. You don't let the true things go." She looked at him. He went back to the harness, and she went back to the kitchen. And that was the last time they spoke directly about any of it for a long while. Not because it was over, but because it had been said, and saying it once to the right person at the right time was enough. Garrett was the last problem to resolve, and he was a problem that resolved itself, which was the best kind. He had been the most resistant of the crew from the beginning, the one Bud had spoken to after the fence move complaint, the one who referred to Evelyn in the cruise company as the cook even after her role had officially changed, the one whose eyes went a certain way when she was speaking in a group that said he was waiting for her to be wrong about something, so the whole arrangement could go back to what he thought it should be. She had not confronted it directly. She had done what she always did with that kind of resistance. She let it sit. She kept working. She waited for the work itself to do what arguments couldn't. What happened in September was this. Garrett's section of fence, the northwest quarter, which he maintained as his crew responsibility, developed a drainage problem at a low point that started to pool water against the posts. He'd been watching it get worse for 3 weeks. She'd been watching him watch it and saying nothing. On a Wednesday morning, he came to the kitchen. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and his jaw at an angle that suggested this was costing him something. "The northwest fence," he said. "The low point near the creek bend," she said. He looked at her. "You knew." "I've known since August." "And you didn't say anything." "It's your section. I was waiting to see how you handled it." His jaw moved. "That's—" He stopped. "You were testing me. I was giving you the chance to see it yourself. There's a difference." She turned back to the stove. "What do you need?" He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know the fix. I know the problem, but I don't know. Drainage channel 2 feet deep, 30 yards, angled south to that natural draw by the aspen stand. You want Hector to walk it with you, or you want me to draw it?" Another silence, longer this time. "Draw it," he said finally. "Please." She drew it. He built it. He built it well, better than she'd expected, actually, with a precision of grade that meant it would keep working for years without maintenance. She told Nathan not as a way of doing Garrett a favor, but as an accurate report of work that had been done correctly. Nathan mentioned it to Garrett directly, in the way Nathan had learned to mention things, straightforwardly without theatrics. She didn't hear what was said. She heard Garrett's tone when he spoke to her the next morning, which was different. Not warm. He wasn't built for warm, or hadn't been yet, but straight. Level. The tone of a man who has stopped waiting for you to fail and started paying attention to what you're actually doing. It was enough. It was exactly enough. The 2nd November brought the kind of cold snap that reminded everyone at Iron Ridge what the 1st November had been. But it was a reminder and not a repetition. The pipes held because they'd been properly insulated in April. The cattle were in the right pastures because the rotation schedule had put them there. The water supply was never a question because the pump ran 30 to 40 gallons an hour out of the limestone 40 feet down. Bud ran the pre-storm check the way he ran everything now, which was differently than he'd run it a year ago, with a list, an actual written list, that contained items Evelyn had put together in August based on what the first storm had revealed about the ranch's weak points. He didn't call it Evelyn's list. He called it the storm checklist. She had no opinion about what he called it. What she noticed was that every item on it got checked. Nathan came to find her on the first cold evening of that 2nd November. She was in the kitchen, always in the kitchen, that hadn't changed. She still cooked most meals and probably always would because she was good at it and it needed doing, and she had never understood the impulse to stop doing something useful just because you'd gotten permission to do something else. And he sat at the table the way he sat at the table now, without it being an event, just a man sitting down in a room where he was comfortable. I had a letter from a rancher in Cascade County, he said. Man named Aldrich. Says Horace Webb told him to write to me about our operations manager. What did he want? Advice on a drainage situation, property-wide. He set the letter on the table. He's asking if you'll come out and consult. She turned from the stove. Come out. Ride out to his property. Spend a few days walking his land. Tell him what you see. Nathan paused. He said to name your price. She looked at the letter. She didn't pick it up. That's a different thing, she said. Yes. I have work here. You can do both. His property is a day's ride. You'd be gone 4 or 5 days at most. He paused. And it would put Iron Ridge on the map in a way that nothing else would. You go out and help a man in Cascade County, and he tells people where you came from. You want me to go. I want you to do what you think is right. I'm telling you, it would be good for this ranch if you did. She thought about it. Not long. She'd been doing fast internal calculations her whole life, and this one wasn't complicated. After the cold snap passes, she said, 1st week of December. She rode to Aldrich's property on a gray December morning with a saddlebag packed for 5 days and the particular quality of attention she brought to new land, open, recording, storing everything. The property was 3 times the size of Iron Ridge, which meant 3 times as much to see. And what she saw in the first 2 hours of walking, it confirmed why he'd written the letter. This was a ranch being managed by a man who was smart and hardworking and genuinely knew cattle, and who had never in his life thought about the land beneath the cattle as something that needed the same quality of attention. She spent 4 days walking his property and 1 day sitting across from him at his kitchen table. A different kitchen, a bigger one, but the same kind of table, the same kind of conversation, and she gave him what she saw. Unvarnished, complete, in the same plain language she'd given Nathan that first night. The drainage problems were extensive. The overgrazing was systematic and going to get worse before it got better. There was a water situation on his north quarter that was going to cost him cattle in a dry year. He listened to all of it without defending himself, which told her he was a man who had already suspected most of it and needed someone to confirm it more than he needed someone to tell him something new. How long to fix it? He said. The drainage, if you start in March, 2 years before it's right. The grazing damage, 3 to 4 years with proper rotation. The water situation on the north quarter you need to address before next summer. That's a lot of years. The damage took longer than that to accumulate. She paused. The good news is it's fixable. All of it. You haven't gone past the point where the land can come back. He looked at her across his kitchen table. He was in his 60s, weathered with the hands and eyes of a man who had been doing this his whole life and taken genuine pride in it. "How does a woman in a ranch kitchen learn to read land like this?" he said. Not unkindly, with actual curiosity, the real kind. She thought about how to answer that honestly. "The same way anyone learns anything," she said. "You pay attention. You remember what you see. You let the land tell you what it's doing instead of telling it what you want it to be doing." She paused. "And you have 30 years of people not listening to you, which gives you a lot of time to keep watching." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to recommend you to every rancher I know in 3 counties," he said. "I'd appreciate that." "It's the least I can do. You've just saved me about 10 years of figuring this out the hard way." He leaned back in his chair. "I have to ask, Caldwell knows what he has in you?" "He's getting there," she said. She rode back to Iron Ridge on a Friday in the last week of December, with the kind of cold that arrives in Montana in late December and settles in like a tenant who's paid up through March. The horse knew the way by the last 5 miles, and she let it pick the pace, sitting easy in the saddle, watching the land go by in the low winter light. She was thinking about something Aldrich had said on the last morning, standing on his porch watching her saddle the horse. He'd said, "The people who built the West that lasted were never the ones who made the most noise about it." And she'd thought about that the whole ride home, turning it over, looking at it from different angles. It wasn't quite right. It was the kind of thing that sounded true but landed a little too neatly, the way observations about history tend to land when they're being said by someone who wants to believe they contain themselves. What she thought was actually closer to this: the West. The enduring part of it, the part that was still standing after the storms and the droughts and the bad winters, was built by people who paid attention. Men and women both, in different ways and under different constraints, who watched the land and listened to it and made their decisions based on what was real rather than what was comfortable to believe. The ones who imposed their idea of what a ranch should look like onto land that had its own ideas generally ended up losing the argument. The ones who were willing to keep learning what the land was telling them. Those were the ones whose fences were still standing when the thaw came. She had paid attention for 20 years in rooms where nobody was watching. And the things she'd learned in those rooms, the things she'd filed and kept and carried in her head across 6 ranches and 1 marriage and more seasons than she could fully account for anymore, those things had mattered. They had always mattered. The only thing that had changed was whether anyone knew. She rode through the Iron Ridge gate as the last of the daylight was going. Hector was at the barn, same as always. He looked up when she came in. "Good trip?" "Productive," she said. "Aldrich figure out what he's dealing with?" "He's figuring it out now." She unsaddled the horse and rubbed it down and fed it, and when she came out of the barn, the windows of the bunkhouse were lit, and she could smell the supper she hadn't cooked from 20 yards away. Danny Pratt had been taking over the kitchen on the days she was out, and he was getting better at it than he thought he was, which was the most common way of getting better at anything. She went to the kitchen door and pushed it open. The warmth came out at her, and the smell of food and fire, and the particular combination of people who had been in close quarters for a while and figured out how to be. Danny was at the stove with his back to her and a dish towel over his shoulder, and a look of concentration on his face that meant he was at the critical stage of something. Caleb was at the table with a piece of paper covered in numbers, which meant he was working out something operational, which was a thing he'd started doing 3 months ago without being asked, pulling the kind of detail work he'd watched Evelyn do until it had become natural enough that he'd started doing it himself. Bud was in the corner chair with his leather notebook open on his knee, writing something, the small focused writing of a man who has recently become convinced that writing things down is worth the effort. Garrett was at the far end of the table, saying something to one of the other hands, and he looked up when she came in and gave her a nod. Not warm, not cold, just level. The nod of a colleague who has accepted you as part of the working world without making a production of the acceptance. And at the table, looking at Caleb's numbers and saying something that made Caleb scratch something out and recalculate, was Nathan Caldwell. He looked up when she came through the door. "Good trip?" he said. "Aldrich will write to you in the spring, about a formal arrangement." "Consulting arrangement?" "Something like that. He's got neighbors who'll want the same thing." Nathan nodded slowly. He looked at her for a moment, the way he'd been looking at her for 8 months now, seeing what was actually there rather than what he'd assumed was there. She'd gotten used to it. She hadn't gotten used to how strange it felt to be seen clearly, which was its own thing, its own ongoing adjustment. "You eat?" he said. "Not since this morning." "Danny," Nathan called, "set another place." Danny turned from the stove. He saw Evelyn, and something in his face shifted. Not surprise exactly, more the relief of someone who hadn't quite admitted to themselves they'd been waiting to see if she came back. He was 20 years old, and he'd spent 3 days in a blizzard on a roof because she'd told him he could. And sometimes the people who do that for you lodge somewhere in you permanently, whether you intend them to or not. "There's enough," he said. "I made too much again." "You always make too much," Caleb said without looking up. "Better than not enough," Danny said. "Evelyn never makes too much." "Evelyn's been cooking for longer than you've been alive." "That's not—" Caleb looked up and saw Evelyn in the doorway and stopped. "When did you get back?" "Just now." "Was it—" He glanced at his paper. "Did you look at his east quarter? I've been wondering about his east quarter drainage ever since Horace Webb mentioned—" "Caleb," Nathan said. "Yeah." "Let her sit down first." She sat down. Someone put a cup in front of her, and she wrapped her hands around it and felt the warmth of it work its way up through 20 years of cracked and scarred and stained at the fingertips hands. And she looked around the table at these imperfect, difficult, slowly changing men who had come to the other side of something hard with her, and she let herself have the moment without trying to file it away or use it for anything. There was a thing she had learned in the past year that she hadn't known how to name before, and sitting in the kitchen at Iron Ridge in December, she found she could almost name it now. It wasn't that being seen made you more real. You were always real, whether or not anyone was looking. What it did was make it possible to stop spending so much energy on carrying alone what could be carried together. All those years of holding everything in her head because there was nowhere else to put it. That weight had been real, and she'd been strong enough for it. But strength and necessity aren't the same thing, and she'd been confusing them for 20 years. The storm hadn't proved her worth. She'd always had worth. What the storm had done was crack open the container that had kept everything she knew in a space too small for it, and let it spill out into the actual work of the actual world where it could do what it was always capable of doing. That was what she would tell someone, if someone asked. If some woman on some other ranch, in some other kitchen, in some future year she wouldn't live to see, found herself filing away what she knew in the only storage that moved with her, Evelyn would tell her, keep watching, keep filing it away. Not because the world will eventually recognize it, because the world is unpredictable, and recognition is not guaranteed to anyone, but because the watching itself is the work, and the work has value independent of whether anyone sees you doing it, and someday, not always, not for everyone, but sometimes, the storm comes, and you already know exactly what to do. Danny set a plate in front of her. He'd made something with beef and root vegetables, and it wasn't elegant, but it was hot, and it was right. "Well," he said. She tasted it. She considered it the way she considered everything. "The carrots need another 3 minutes next time," she said. "Everything else is good." He sat down across from her with the satisfied expression of a 20-year-old who has just been told that most of what he did was right, and one specific thing was wrong, which is the most useful kind of feedback there is. 3 minutes, he said, and she could see him filing it away. Good, she thought. That's how it starts. The fire in the kitchen stove burned the way a good fire burns. Steady, without drama, doing exactly what it was built to do. Outside the window, the Montana December was doing what it did, going dark and cold and absolute stars coming out over the valley in the particular clarity that follows when the air has nothing left to hide behind. Iron Ridge Ranch sat in that dark the way it had sat through 100 winters before this one, and would sit through 100 more after. The buildings holding their ground, the fences standing where they needed to stand, the cattle settled into the pastures where the work of the year had put them. The northern fence line, 30 feet east of where it had been. The pump in the east field still running. The canyon, empty now and quiet, waiting for whatever the next winter brought. And in the kitchen, the light stayed on.